Now, we know that Porter is important within the SBL syllabus, and if any model is at the top, then it's this. Porter's 5 forces. These forces are, in one sense, the sort of essence of the industry or market. Before we go into the model here, let's just define exactly what we mean by competition and indeed competitors, and indeed how this ties into Porter's thesis on the 5 forces. So when we think about competition, what do we mean? Well, really, the idea of any sort of activity within the industry that affects the level of margin earned. So if we think about it, if we have a fiercely competitive environment, a fiercely competitive industry, then clearly the level of margin earned will be lower. In one sense, what Porter does within this thesis on the 5 forces is really say, if we have a particular industry or indeed a market where the range of forces is very, very strong, in effect, the competition level is very, very high, then this probably makes that market or that industry less attractive and indeed less profitable, i.e. the margins will be lower. So if we take a look at the model itself and indeed the various elements of it and really the areas that strengthen the forces or weaken the forces, what we'll see in effect if we focus right on the middle is that in the middle we have this area of rivalry, or if you will, competitive rivalry. And then on the outside we have the 4 other forces. So in essence, really, the most important force, and indeed the force that drives margins or drives attractiveness or drives profitability, is this one, is rivalry. And all the other 4 are sort of secondary in one sense. So if we go from bargaining power of buyers first, and we go around the model, what do we mean first and foremost by buyers? Well, we're talking about consumers. We're talking about customers. So, for example, in the cell phone industry, you and I are buyers. And indeed, when we talk about bargaining power of buyers, broadly speaking, we're talking about the degree to which a buyer, let's say me or you, can influence a telecoms firm, can influence perhaps price, or can influence the deal. So in essence, when we say bargaining power of buyers, we're talking about the strength or the power of buyers, the degree to which they can place some sort of pressure or some sort of influence on the company itself. Now, when we think about what factors impact upon that particular strength of force, there are a variety. And indeed note that with an SBL exam type question, what the examiner will be doing is perhaps looking to see if you can pick up these various elements from the scenario. So we'll deal with some but not all. So when we think of this bargaining power of buyers, first things first, the concentration of buyers. In other words, if there are fewer buyers in this industry or market, it's highly likely that they're going to be more powerful. With the example that I gave you in terms of the cell phone industry, obviously there are millions and millions of buyers in the market. So for any cell phone company, perhaps to lose you or perhaps to listen to your concerns about price or indeed the cost of the phone, that's probably quite unlikely. Because at the end of the day, there are millions and millions of other buyers. So your power to influence a cell phone company is very, very low or very, very weak. Other areas that are sort of relevant here, let's pick out low switching costs. What do we mean by switching costs? We're talking about really the idea that there is a cost associated from, let's say, switching from one cell phone company to another. And broadly speaking, although it will vary from situation to situation, broadly speaking, there is a fairly low switching cost for an individual to change cell phone suppliers. So in essence, in one sense, you would suggest that really, well, the power is quite high in that respect. In other words, it's quite easy for a cell phone user to switch from one company to the other. But certainly in relation to the example I've just given, i.e. cell phones, really, yes, that's one area that sort of supports the power of buyers, but there are too many others in that scenario that sort of undermine it. Outside of that, when we think about things like the cost of the purchase, in other words, the degree to which this purchase is a high proportion or a high element of total overall cost, that's certainly relevant too. So in essence, in relation to the bargaining power of buyers, really what we're saying is, what are the factors that sort of either strengthen that force or weaken it? And obviously in SBL type scenarios, it's going to vary from question to question. In essence, let's remember with each of the 5 forces, and particularly the ones on the outside, we're really looking to assess as to whether or not the force is high strength, medium, or low strength. Let's take a look at bargaining power of suppliers now. Now again, what do we mean by this? We're talking about any suppliers. So for example, if we have a company manufacturing widgets, whatever they are, we're talking about really the source of inputs into the manufacture of that widget. Now again, first things first, when we think about suppliers to, let's say, the manufacturer of widgets, if there are very, very few suppliers, so for example, if a part, if a component, if a raw material is quite difficult to obtain, and indeed there are only a few suppliers for that particular part or component, then certainly the power will be going up, because the firm or indeed the entity may find it difficult to source that component or part elsewhere. So if there are a low number of suppliers, a little bit like buyers, if there are a low number of buyers, as we said, the power goes up. It's the same with suppliers. Outside of that, when we think about substitutes, really what we're talking about there is really a particular sort of product or indeed a service that satisfies the same needs, but that is manufactured or delivered in a different way. So in one sense, what we're saying there, if there are very, very few substitutes in this sense, then obviously the power is going to go up. Outside of that, same thing here we saw for buyers, switching costs are high. In other words, the bargaining power of suppliers is higher where an entity is going to incur high costs to switch to another supplier. Perhaps in the form of a contract, perhaps in the form of they need to go abroad, etc., etc., etc. Outside of that, let's take a look at differentiation here. When we say the product, the supplier's product is differentiated, what we're talking about is that the supplier has a product that has some unique characteristics. In other words, it's very, very difficult to obtain this quality, this type of product, or this particular supplier's product has a number of features that other suppliers' products do not have, and we need that particular element, that particular component, that particular part. So in essence, what we're saying here is that the power of this particular supplier goes up when the supplier is producing a product that we need, that is very, very different and indeed unique in some respect to other suppliers' products. So that deals with the left-hand side, the buyers, and indeed the right-hand side, the suppliers. And you'll note that there's certainly a parallel, a crossover between the two. Let's take a look at barriers to entry now, okay? Now, what we mean here, remember, we're talking about competition. We're talking about a given industry or market. And what Porter says under the banner of barriers to entry is that there may be a number of elements sort of in play in that industry, in that market, that really discourage firms from entering it, or maybe encourage firms to get out of it. What do we mean by economies of scale? Well, it may well be that there are large players in the industry that are producing massive volumes. And in effect, what they're doing is that they're spreading their fixed costs over their production and or their sales. In other words, they have economies of scale. Because they're so large, their cost base, in effect, per unit is much, much lower. Now, in essence, to compete with companies like that, or to enter the market and compete, it's difficult because they already have these massive, well-established economies of scale. And indeed, they may well have other cost advantages. Another obvious barrier to entry is capital requirements. Let's say that you're looking to enter a market, and indeed that particular market requires a massive investment of cash. That may be difficult to come by. That's what we mean by capital. Do you have enough funding to be able to enter this market? And note, in effect, what we're saying is that if these barriers to entry are very, very high, then in effect, this force is very, very strong. This makes the industry, or indeed the market, less attractive. So in other words, high barriers to entry makes the industry an industry, or the market a market. Well, you'll be thinking, well, this is a tough market to enter into. Let's take one other here. What about reactions of existing firms? In other words, what we're saying is, let's just say that you're considering entering a particular market or industry. If players who exist in the market already will react in some way quite aggressively, for example, in relation to, let's say, prices or price wars, etc., that's not going to be good news. That's going to be difficult. You may think that they may not do anything, but as soon as you enter, or 2 to 3 months after, a price war starts. That's not good for business. That makes this industry or market potentially risky to enter, unattractive, and possibly a market with maybe low margins, low profitability in due course. So in essence, note that in relation to barriers to entry, really what we're talking about is, things that make it difficult, things that make it tricky for entities to newly enter a market. Okay? Now, a couple of other points. In terms of our overall fix so far, really what we're saying, remember, is that in the application of Porter's 5 forces, we're trying to assess what Porter suggests are the key or main forces that make an industry attractive or unattractive, or profitable or non-profitable. So let's take a look at the fourth and indeed last force before we look right smack bang in the middle at rivalry again. The threat of new substitutes. Now, let's be clear here, and it's an area that students tend to fall down on. A substitute. What is it? First things first, a substitute is not a competitor's product. It's not a direct substitute, as it were, in the normal sense of the word, for your product. A substitute, as I said earlier on, is really a product that satisfies the same need, but it is manufactured or delivered in a different way. One more time. It satisfies the same need, but it's manufactured or delivered in a different way. So maybe a typical example would be something like Coke or Coca-Cola and water. What's the need? Thirst. Are they, direct competitors? I don't think so. But are they substitute products? You could substitute one for the other. Yes, you could. Why? Because certainly they satisfy the need for thirst, but they're manufactured and delivered in a completely different way. So be careful on this area. I've seen students get confused here and say, well, it's basically the same as a competitor product. No, Coca-Cola and Pepsi are competitor products, but they're not substitutes as such. We're talking about a product that really is based on a need, okay? Now, in terms of the questions here, when we think about the threat of new substitutes, so we're talking really about anything, any other product that satisfies the same need. You might even include, for example, cell phones versus landlines. So here, second bullet point down, to what extent is there a danger? Well, are there a lot of substitute products? Because if there are, we have a concern. Obviously, we also have a concern if there are many, many competitor products. But substitutes, remember, is different. So, are there many, many other substitute products? Could customers, could they simply replace our product in some way quite easily? If they can, then this threat is high. We're concerned that makes this market or industry less attractive, less profitable. Outside of that, maybe, okay, there are substitute products, but, can we do something about it? Can we minimize this threat? Could we maybe differentiate our product more, or indeed do something about our costs or lower our prices? Outside of that, bottom line is this. We've been through the four main forces here, and we've considered areas that drive the power up or possibly drive the power down. Now, when we take a look at the middle, remember, as we said, in relation to rivalry, really, what we're talking about is, a variety of different things, number, strength, differentiation, etc., etc., etc. So, in essence, this factor, this force in the middle, which in one sense is probably the most important one, indeed driven on by each of the other four, where they're a similar size, where these rivals are a similar size, then certainly that makes things much, much worse, because they may well have similar strategies, similar approaches, etc. Outside of that, imagine a market where, let's say, there are a number of rivals, and indeed they are a similar size, and it is broadly profitable. If there's slow growth in the market, that makes things more difficult because people are fighting for inches. Outside of that, think about things like differentiation. If it's very, very difficult for firms to differentiate the product because of its nature or type, that makes rivalry even more pronounced. Last one here, a little bit unusual. We're thinking about a particular industry. Well, let's say it's extremely difficult to exit. For example, let's say clothing stores, retail high streets where you're tied into leases over 5, 10, 15, 20 years. It may well be that you're a bit stuck. It's difficult or indeed expensive to exit that market. That makes things much more competitive on the high street. So in essence, in relation to Porter's five forces, I've said several things. The first thing is this is a very, very important model. And indeed, within the SBL exam, note that the examiner very, very rarely sort of highlights the use or requires the use of a particular model. What he tends to say are things like use a suitable model. And where he does, and where the scenario or the requirement is in the area of assessment of an industry or assessment of a market, more often than not, Porter's five forces is one of our go-to models, along with, say, Pestel or possibly Porter's Diamond. But Porter's five forces is certainly up there with many, many other models in terms of highly examinable. So have a fix on it, have a fix on each of the five forces, particularly the four on the outside, and be prepared to look at scenarios and maybe pick up little hints here and there of areas that are either driving the power of the force up or driving it down. Okay? I hope that makes sense.